Why don't we get this meeting rolling? So Laura, could you call the roll call?
Commissioner Haskell,
Here.
Commissioner Goulden,
Present.
Commissioner Targ,
Present.
Vice Chair Koff-Sill,
Here.
Chair Taylor.
Present. Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. We have 5 attendees in addition to the panelists. We'll start with oral communications. Oral communications are things that are not on the agenda tonight. So if you have something to say about the ADUs and the municipal code amendments, please hold that till we get to new business. Otherwise, I will open it up, and it looks like Betsy is requesting comment. So Laura, can you let her in?
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Chair and Commissioners.
Welcome.
A number of us are anticipating the release of the MIG CEQA documents for the Neely project. And I wanted to know if you were expecting, if planning, the director was expecting to receive it in time for this Monday's ASCC meeting, as I would, it's now grown to $66,000 report, and it's worthy of, I think, a good read. So advance notice would be appreciated.
I mean, through the chair, the document is not completed yet. Additional studies are being done. This item is not on the agenda for ASCC on Monday, and we certainly appreciate the feedback about making it available well in advance of a meeting when it is reviewed. So thank you.
It's very reassuring to hear that. Thank you. And does that mean in advance, can we take that to mean a week or 10 days?
We don't have a schedule yet. It will certainly be available when the packet is published, but we understand that there's a lot of interest in this topic and in this study. So we will do our best to make it available well in advance of that to the extent that we can.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other oral communications before we move to new business?
And there's one person that's on the phone. If you're on the phone and you wish to raise your hand, use *9 to raise your hand on the phone.
Great, thank you. All right, seeing no additional oral communications, let's move on to new business. So the accessory dwelling unit municipal code amendment. Laurel, Dylan, I'm not sure who has a staff report for us.
Cara does.
Cara, of course. There are only 3 people I could have picked and I got it wrong. No problem. All right, Cara, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So let's see. Am I able to share my screen, Laura? Or is Dylan going to run the presentation?
You should be able to. Hold on a second. Try that now.
You know,
I can run it on my computer if that helps.
that would be
I
great.
I have it loaded
Thank
up. Okay.
you.
I'll go ahead and share my screen with everybody. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
All right.
Great.
Um,
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I'm Cara Silver, the town attorney, and we wanted to present the ADU ordinance update for 2021. This implements the new state laws that went into effect January 1, 2020. Next slide. So the purpose of this meeting is to introduce the amendments that went into effect January 1, 2020. They were adopted in 2019. We're calling them the 2020 state law amendments. There were a series of bills, and we will explain the high level highlights of those bills. We wanted to summarize staff's approach to implement these new bills. We want to receive input from residents and the Planning Commission on the proposal that staff is presenting. And then, unlike the 2019 effort, which involved a lot of policy changes and decisions, this effort, although you will see a lot of red line strikeouts, is relatively ministerial in that it really tries to stick with just implementing the state law requirements. So we would expect to return shortly with a draft ordinance that you could review and pass on to the City Council. Next slide. So in terms of the agenda, I wanted to just briefly go over what you all did in 2019, review the 2020 state law updates, and then discuss our recommendation for implementing these updates. And the recommendation actually falls into two buckets. One is primarily focused on the state requirements. And then the second bucket of recommendations we have really relate to administrative items that staff has encountered in connection with implementing our existing ordinance over the past couple of years. And then we will talk about the next steps that are needed. Next slide, Dylan. So as you know, in 2019, you did a lot of work on the local amendments to the ADU ordinance. It was a big effort, a heavy lift, which the Planning Commission really championed, and we appreciate all that work that you did. We are very comfortable with the structure and the foundation of the 2019 amendments. We are not recommending that the structure be changed at all. In terms of some of the major policy decisions that you made, most of those policy decisions really went towards encouraging the increased development of ADUs in Portola Valley. One of the things that you did was you expanded the permitted zoning districts in town where ADUs could be developed, and you expanded that to all zoning districts, including commercial zoning districts in town. There was obviously a lot of discussion about the fire safety exception, but other than the fire safety exception, ADUs are permitted anywhere in town. You also spent a lot of time on ADU size. The current ordinance is a very generous ordinance. It sets a maximum ADU size of 1,200 for parcels of less than 3.5 acres and a maximum size of 1,500 square feet for parcels of 3.5 acres or more. You also took a look at the parking restrictions regarding ADUs. Parking is generally one of the major obstacles to constructing ADUs, and you relaxed the parking requirements for internal ADUs. And so now with internal ADUs, they are exempt from parking requirements. You also reduced the parking requirements for external ADUs so that they only need to provide one parking space. And finally, you took a look at the review thresholds. And previously, most ADUs in town had to go through some type of discretionary review process. But you, in 2019, created a ministerial process for certain types of ADUs. And then you also created a staff level discretionary process, which was a more streamlined process for permitting ADUs than had been in effect in the past. And then you created a third tier of discretionary review that went to the ASCC for a more extensive design review. Next slide. So now we want to get into the state law amendments. First, I wanted to provide a caveat that the legislation that was adopted, as I mentioned, involved several different bills. Some of the bills were inconsistent with one another. The ADU ordinance or statute in general is considered to be one of the most complicated statutes in the land use planning field. It has a lot of internally inconsistent provisions. It contains a lot of gaps, and it is very difficult to administer as a result. HCD has recently stepped in and they've issued a 40-page guidebook on interpreting this statute. Practitioners don't all agree with HCD's interpretations, and it's still considered a rather ambiguous area of the law, but we all do our best to interpret it. And I think if it hadn't been for the pandemic, there would have been some further clarifying amendments at the legislative level, but we don't expect those to come down this year, and they certainly didn't come down last year. So with that caveat, I do want to just go into the highlights of the state law. The big change that the state made was that now one ADU and one junior accessory dwelling unit must be permitted in every single family lot. A junior accessory dwelling unit is, it's generally a bedroom conversion. It generally contains a kitchenette, and it can have its own bathroom, or it can share a bathroom with the main house. The legislature also did some tinkering with the maximum size of ADUs, and now towns are prohibited from establishing a maximum ADU size of less than 850 square feet for singles and one-bedroom ADUs, or 1,000 square feet for ADUs containing 2 or more bedrooms. The third major focus of the ADU state law was that it created 3 categories of ADUs that must be permitted by right. So the first category relates to new construction of ADUs in single family districts or on lots containing single family dwellings. And cities and towns must permit new construction ADUs of up to 800 square feet, 16 feet in height, with 4 feet side and rear setbacks. There is no requirement for a 4-foot front side setback. That currently was, or that previously was, an issue of debate, but HCD has now weighed in and said that there is no 4-foot setback in the front yard. Again, it's not specified in the statute, so that may be an evolving issue. The second type of by right ADU is a conversion. A conversion consists of existing space not only within the single family building or main building, but also within an accessory structure or a garage located on the lot. You'll recall that garage conversions were previously required under state law, but now the state law has been expanded to also include other accessory buildings that might be located on the property. The third category of by right ADUs consist of ADUs that are in multifamily districts or in single family districts that contain multifamily buildings. We do not have a lot of these in Portola Valley, but yeah, other agencies that do have apartment buildings and other multifamily dwellings are really wrestling with this provision because it is a brand new concept. Basically, it permits 2 detached ADUs in a multifamily lot. And it also permits the non-livable space of a condominium building or other multifamily building to be converted to an ADU up to 25% of the total space. What this is generally thought to include is underground basements. There are some multifamily buildings that have some HVAC equipment that is on a separate floor that theoretically could be converted. It's sort of an intriguing concept. Next slide, please. We've also talked about the setbacks. So setbacks is a major area of change. Now setbacks are can be 4 feet for side and rear. We talked about parking garage conversions, but what the state law also does is if a garage is converted to an ADU, which is a very common type of conversion, the parking for the main building now does not need to be replaced. As I mentioned, multifamily ADUs are now permitted, and junior ADUs are now permitted. So our current ordinance has a provision for junior ADUs. It really just has a definition, and it states that junior ADUs are not considered ADUs. So there really is not a permitting process for junior ADUs under our current ordinance. So the new ordinance will have to accommodate junior ADUs. The state law also contains a 5-year window where cities are not allowed to enforce owner occupancy requirements. Our existing ordinance already addresses this issue, so it's not a big deal for Portola Valley. The state law also prohibits ADUs of less than 750 square feet from paying impact fees. Cities and towns can charge impact fees for ADUs larger than 750 square feet. And finally, this is the biggest issue in terms of the implementation of the state law. Previously, state law required that ADU permits be granted within 120 days of the application being deemed complete. Now state law has reduced that to 60 days, which is a very, very tight window. Next slide. So planning staff and our office has had several meetings to discuss how to implement the new state law mandates. The ordinance that the town adopts needs to receive approval from HCD. And so it is important that the ordinance complies with all of the state law requirements. However, of course, local considerations must also be taken into account, and HCD is expecting that cities and towns take an approach that accommodates local considerations. One of the things that we looked at internally as a staff is that the maximum size that related to was contained in the state law. Now there are 2 different maximum sizes. One size, 850 square feet, relates to the smaller ADUs of 1 bedroom or less. And then there's another maximum size that related to ADUs of more than 1 bedroom. And that's capped at 1,000 square feet. So we did not see a need really to have a distinction between 850 square feet versus 1,000 square foot ADU. We really, governing number of bedroom size is kind of a personal decision. We didn't think that the town needs to get involved in that. So we thought that what our recommendation is just to remove the number of bedrooms from the equation and just go with the 1,000 foot higher number. It simplified things, and we thought that it was respectful of some of the previous policy decisions that the town has made with respect to allowing larger ADUs in any event. The issue that we focused most on was the setbacks, especially with the larger properties that are not accustomed to having 4-foot setbacks for structures. That's going to be a big impact to the community. So what we thought to address that was that we really want to encourage homeowners to construct units that comply with the existing underlying zoning setbacks. And so to do that, we built in some incentives. So we'll explain it in the next slide, but they could have some additional development rights if they comply with the underlying zoning incentives. And then the third sort of local consideration we took into consideration was, again, the fire safety exception that was developed by the Planning Commission over several meetings. We're carrying that forward, and we're also recommending the addition of a geologic exception as well to take into account local considerations. Next slide. So in terms of the setbacks, the current code says that the ADU must comply with the existing underlying zoning setbacks, and those vary between 20 and 25 depending on the particular residential zone for rear setbacks, and 10 to 25 for side setbacks. The height is the same for all residential districts, 18 feet vertical, 24 feet total height. As mentioned, the state law says 4 feet side and rear setbacks. So our proposal is to provide really an incentive, as I mentioned, to comply with the underlying zoning setbacks. Next slide, Dylan. So what the ordinance proposes is that if an ADU uses the underlying zoning code setbacks, they can build an ADU of 1,200 square feet, which is larger than the 1,000 square feet, which is considered the maximum size ADU under state law if you build more than for 1 or more bedrooms. And then they can have the full 18-foot, 24-foot total height if they comply with the zoning setbacks. For larger parcels, they can build up to 1,500 square foot ADU. And then on the other hand, if the property owner is seeking to provide 4-foot setbacks, which are allowed under state law now, then we would only allow them to build 1,000-foot ADU on both small and large parcels with a total height of 16 feet. So the thought process there is that a smaller ADU with a smaller size or height would have less impact to an abutting property owner with that 4-foot setback. Next slide. Then I'm going to review, that's really the most sort of complex change that we are implementing. The other ones are more ministerial because they really are just required by state law. As I mentioned, we are including a provision to permit junior ADUs. We are also codifying the 3 state required by right ADUs that I mentioned previously. We're also codifying the 60-day processing timeline. We're updating the definitions. In our last code change, I think there was a lot of effort made to make a user-friendly document and make it approachable, make the language more approachable. Unfortunately now, with the existing state law that is so tied to particular definitions, it was difficult to use our existing definitions. And so we have now transported the state law definitions into our local ordinance, making it a little more formal, but easier to align with state law. We have added the clarification regarding the replacement parking for garage conversions. We have clarified the owner occupancy waiver for 5 years. And then we have required an owner occupancy requirement for junior ADUs. That an owner occupancy requirement is permitted for a junior ADU. And again, a junior ADU is generally a like a bedroom conversion. Next slide, please. Then the next category or bucket of changes that we are recommending deal more with administrative issues. The first, or local concerns, the first issue is a geologic hazard exception. Cities are permitted to regulate the location of ADUs if there is a legitimate health or safety reason. And so we think that the geologic hazard exception, similar to the fire safety exception, is appropriate here. We're also adding a provision that allows the planning director to adopt guidelines to implement the ordinance and to make interpretations. Again, because of the vagueness of the state law, we think that this is really an important power and authority for the planning director to have, especially in this area. We also noticed that in connection with administering the current ordinance, that there was an issue that came up with basements. And so we are recommending that basements that are built under an ADU should be discouraged. And if they are built, if they do not have an internal access to the ADU, they would count towards the AMFA. And then we are also, we have also added a provision discouraging covered parking for ADUs. And if an ADU is built, or if a parking space is built with covered parking, then that would also count towards the AMFA. Next slide. So in terms of the next steps, we would like to receive input from residents and the Planning Commission. Again, we mentioned that we would return shortly with a draft ordinance. We have tentatively scheduled May 19th for that ordinance. Then it would go to the Town Council for a first reading and a second reading. And then, as I mentioned, HCD will need to approve our final ordinance. And that concludes the staff report. I've included some of the questions that we put in our staff report up on this slide and on the next slide if you wanted to give us input on those, we'd be happy to take that input.
Great.
And I'm
Thank
happy
you,
to answer
Cara.
any
That was-
questions. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very helpful. So are there any questions from commissioners? And then I'll open it up to the general public.
Yep. I'll dive in and hopefully some of my questions are others as well. So not in a particular order, but the setback of 4 feet. I understand you're building in the exceptions to encourage greater setbacks, but could you remind me the current safety exception for fire? How does that work? Because you're saying maybe a geologic one would be added, but the current one for fire, or what is the current situation with regard to a safety exception for fire as to a setback?
Right. So the fire exception, it doesn't relate to setbacks. If you're in a particular fire zone, then you just can't construct an ADU.
Okay, thank you. If there's a converted garage, there's no setback, if I understood you correctly, but can an applicant take an existing garage of 800 square feet or something like that and affirmatively increase the size of that garage up to the property line?
No,
So they have to stay within the footprint?
correct.
Okay, thank you. The multifamily exception, what properties would that include? And importantly, would it include the Stanford Wedge properties?
Right. So it could include the Priory, the Sequoias, let's see, the Stanford Wedge. Laura, do you recall whether those are subdivided lots? Yes. Okay. So the single family homes are separate lots, but to the extent there are some, I think it's 8 units, 2 lots have 8 units each on them. Those would be considered multifamily.
And eligible for ADUs. So when we're thinking about density there, okay.
Yes.
All right. I think the JADU, there's language in your write-up about let's be more flexible and require an efficiency kitchen, I think. Can you just explain that a little bit more? What flexibility does that bring?
Yes, I'm not sure if it's more flexible. What we thought with a JADU, so previously under the old version of state law, a JADU was defined as having an efficiency kitchen. Now under JADU, you don't have to have an efficiency kitchen. You can have a regular kitchen or you can have no kitchen. What we are recommending is that a JADU be required in town to have a kitchen, because then we would have an argument with, or we would be able to hopefully use that towards our RENA. A unit without a kitchen would not be counted towards RENA.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm nearly done. In terms of the 2 questions on administration type things. One is if you could comment on the ministerial review, the impact of having the amount of time for that review, if if you or the planner can help us understand how big a hurdle that is, like a couple of simple statements. And then the second one is the new proposition for being able to interpret rules, regulations, et cetera. A couple of examples of why that might be needed, helpful. That would be great.
Sure. So I think that the planning director should talk about the impact of this 60-day review. And I can speak to the need for an interpretation. So for instance, the law currently, the state law does not contain any language about front yard setbacks. So before we had guidance from HCD, there was just an open issue. And so that would be something where state law doesn't provide for it. We have our existing zoning ordinance that has a front yard setback. And so it would be helpful for the planning director then to opine whether the front yard setback was enforceable or not, whether the local front yard setback was enforceable. Those are the types of opinions we would expect to receive.
Okay, and that's it for now. Thank you.
I'm sorry,
Thanks,
did you
Laura.
want me to speak to the timing issue?
Yeah,
Yes.
please, Laura, go ahead.
So we do think it will be a challenge, but we think that we can meet it. An important provision of the state law is that the 60 days starts when the application is complete. So this is language that we often use for discretionary applications. We call them deemed complete when all the materials have been received. So using that for ministerial projects is a little bit new and different, but we're going to use the same concept, meaning the 60 days won't start until we have all of the application materials. And we've reviewed all of them, and we have all the parts and pieces, reports that may be necessary, all of the plans, the fees, the forms, and that's when we would start the 60 days. So we think by creating the proper procedures in place, we'll be able to meet it.
So Laura, a little further question on that. So if you're waiting to hear from, say, the county health department, would that be something that's part of a complete application? Or is that something that happens afterwards?
In general, some of these things we still have to iron out, but in general, we would be looking for the county health department to give at least their preliminary review or look at it. We're trying to find deal breakers that come up front. And so we've been trying to advise people to do that kind of work in advance. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. We're trying to prepare them to be successful in the 60-day review process.
Yeah, I guess my concern was if you have an outside agency that does not comply with the 60 days, the applicant gets their project approved, the town basically doesn't have control over that because it's an external review. So is there some way we can make sure that we tighten that down so that the 60 days doesn't end up being the vagaries of the county or Woodside Fire or somebody not getting back in time?
Yeah, I think that that's a great comment. And I think that that's something we can think about and figure out how to address. So I don't know, if you have any immediate answer to that, but I think we can definitely put some thought into it.
And we can do more of this in the discussion. I just wanted to at least get it sort of into the conversation. Okay, great. Other commissioners, comments? John, go ahead.
So yeah, I've got several here, and also in no particular order, but sort of picking up on the RENA goals. So we said that if we put the junior ADUs with efficiency kitchens, it would help. Does it help towards the current goals or the future goals? Is the timing of this, do we know which side it falls on or will fall on?
Right. So it would help with both. If we receive JADU applications this cycle, then it would count towards this cycle. If it if we receive them in the future, it will also help towards RENA goals in future cycles.
Okay. But the reason I ask that is sometimes the RENA goals are you must make available as opposed to you must have provided. That's why I was thinking there might be a distinction there.
Right.
Okay. In terms of jumping into the recommendation for an incentive. So how the incentives that you're talking about seem fine, but isn't that what we really already have in place now? Is there some distinction from what we have in place now that I missed?
We don't really have an incentive now. So we have a requirement that applicants comply with the setbacks of the
Right.
base zoning district. So we
But aren't
don't
the
have an
numbers-
incentive.
But aren't the numbers that the incentive number that you give, aren't those what we currently allow?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, on purpose.
Right. So John, I think the idea is if you comply with what we've already approved
Right.
and you use the regular setbacks, you're good. But if you want to take advantage of these new reduced setbacks
Right.
that the state's mandating, then we're going to just force you, we're going to hold you
Yes.
to the state limits.
Yeah. So I wanted to just make sure
Right.
there wasn't some additional incentive we were considering here, which is something we might do, but right now it's really just what we have in place. Another question. Is there, given that some things are in flux with the state law, are we in danger of implementing too early on something and giving away something we don't want to give away?
Well, that's a good question. The law went into effect, January 1. And so to some extent, we're already implementing the state law because we have had a couple of applicants who have applied under the state law. And the state law says that to the extent the local regulations are inconsistent with the state law trumps the local law. So in effect, we are implementing the state law, but we are implementing it in a way that is not as transparent to the public because it's not codified in our local ordinance. So I think that just as a matter of practice, we would prefer to have all of the regulations in one place codified in our local ordinance. And this is one area of the law where we will probably have to do some additional tweaks and adjustments, as new bills come out or as new interpretations are made.
Right. But so we don't feel like we're jumping the gun here at all. I specifically, I wondered, sort of related, but on the question of the setbacks again. So on the 4 foot side and rear, sounds like that's just done. We have to do that.
Right.
On the front side, wouldn't we be able to just leave in place our current ordinance? I mean,
yes.
and that's
And
how
we
we would, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, John,
Yeah,
could I follow on to your question for just a minute?
you may.
So, I mean, given this is all in flux and presumably there's going to be more legislation, let's assume that the state passes some new laws to clarify this stuff. And instead of making it sort of more restrictive, they make it more liberal. Like they say, well, the setbacks don't have to be 4 feet anymore. They could be 8 feet. If we codify this in our regulations, then will the state law trump those, or because they're kind of more generous, people go, well, no, I want to use the town restrictions. Like how could that get, I'm kind of flipping it around, but assuming that there are going to be additional things coming out of the Capitol and not necessarily all of them are going to be further, narrowing, but what if they widened it? What would we do?
Right. So if the state makes things more restrictive and our code is more liberal, then our code would control in that situation. But if the state said, currently we have 4-foot setbacks, but we're going to liberalize that and allow 8 feet setbacks. But our code had codified the 4-foot. Our code would, our local code would prevail in that situation. However, we could always amend the code to comply with state law.
Craig, if I may, through you, ask a follow-up.
Yeah.
Could you not say, instead of 4 feet, or if a lesser distance, whatever distance is required by the state statute, rather than,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
State required,
Yes.
state requirements.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yes. And that's and we do that sometimes in proposing local laws when we anticipate that there will be an area that is likely to change from year to year. I don't know that setbacks is that area.
Yeah,
Yeah.
understand.
I got more questions. So on the multifamily ADUs, or multifamily units, so I understood the Priory and Sequoia and these multifamily units that are proposed for the Stanford Wedge. Are we in any danger of virtue of somebody adding an ADU, turning that original house into a multifamily unit that then is allowed additional ADUs?
That's an excellent question, and that is one of the ambiguities that this law has now created. Because really, if you are now entitled under state law to 1 ADU and 1 JADU, in addition to your main building, that's 3 separate dwelling units on a single family property. And your question is that a multifamily property? I don't think that was the intent of the law, but it sort of falls under that definition.
Okay.
This might be an area where you might have a director's interpretation that would stand unless there's a state law change or a case law situation where we wanted to change that interpretation.
Right. Something about the historical basis of the site controlling it versus current state or something like that. Another question. So impact fees. Could you tell me a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, Portola Valley does not have a lot of impact fees compared to other jurisdictions. In Portola Valley, we have a housing impact fee when you're adding more than 1 unit. When if you're just replacing the unit, then it doesn't kick in. But for instance, the Stanford project would be required to pay an impact fee if they didn't choose to provide inclusionary affordable units on site. We also have, for subdivisions, we have a park fee. And let's see, Laura, do we have any other impact fees?
These would apply to at 750 feet. Right? I mean, we don't have any fees that would apply in this particular case. Is that correct?
That's correct. Some places have other fee structures. Craig Hughes is asking school district impact fees. School districts impact fees are regulated separately. And so I believe the school district fees would still apply. I don't know if you agree with that, Cara.
So I guess I was heading around the line of, so what kind of things are impact fees, with the idea of, should we consider things like infrastructure fees and that, if we're going to make some dramatic change, some potentially dramatic changes here in terms of the number of people and kids in schools and whatever, is there something we should be considering?
I see what you're saying. Yes. So, and yes, you should, you should be. It's certainly just a resource issue. Generally, with when you're building a single family home, you don't have impact fees. The norm is that you don't charge impact fees on just one single family home. However, in Portola Valley, the homes are larger, there are other accessory uses or buildings, and they're, you know, a single family home can create some infrastructure impacts. So, you know, it certainly is an issue that could be considered.
I think, and the only other question I think I had was, I thought I had read something in the new state laws that talked about being able to demolish a structure and move it elsewhere, and keep whatever was allowed for that original structure in place. Did I read that correctly, or how is that interpreted?
Yes, you can. I think that applies to like the accessory structure conversions that you, as long as you don't increase the footprint, which, you know, which is what Judith asked earlier, then you can replace that an accessory structure and it will be counted as a conversion such that you don't need to comply with setbacks.
Right, so you could take the existing size and move it to within 4 foot of the lot line.
Yes, you could do that, but why not just build a new one?
No, I'm saying you demolish the old one, but you keep effectively the same footprint, but now you get to relocate it within 4 foot of the lot line.
Right.
And then that would be allowed, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
But John, are you asking whether it was larger?
No, that was the question Judith asked, but I was clarifying that, but you actually could demolish your garage and build something of the same size, except you move it to within 4 foot of the lot line, whereas previously it wasn't. That's what I was trying to clarify.
But it would have to be an ADU, if I understand. You couldn't build a garage there. You'd have
Oh, correct. It's convert. Yes, correct.
Right, but so to Kara's point, why not just build it? Like what, I'm missing the subtlety of your question, which is, why does the demolition matter if you're gonna just put something at the 4 foot?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, no, I just didn't know if there was something I was missing.
Yeah, I had something really, really brilliant in mind. The answer was no. I just know what I read, something I was trying to understand it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's some loophole that somebody will find a way to take advantage of. Okay, John, do you have any other questions?
Yes.
Just on that question, I think probably what you were referring to is just that there is a specific section that says if you are doing if you demolish an existing structure, you can rebuild it with the same footprint and the same setbacks.
Even if it was a non-compliant or what
Exactly.
was non-compliant, right? Okay.
Non-conforming.
Yes.
Non-conforming. Okay, that's it.
Great, thank you, John.
I have a few
Ann, go ahead.
questions. Yeah. Cara, when we did the 2019 revision on the ADUs, we specifically allowed them on all lots now, where they previously had been only larger lots, I think bigger than an acre. But we did put in this exclusion for fire safety, that if the road was a cul-de-sac or only had one way in and was a certain narrowness, then we said that the new rules did not apply to those lots. In this new state regulation that all lots are allowed to have an ADU, does the state rule trump that road exclusion we put in, or that still can be excluded because of the fire safety?
Yes, as long as we make specific findings regarding the fire safety. And the same rules would apply as long as we make specific findings regarding seismic safety or geologic safety. The point is that it's harder to restrict, obviously, ADUs, but if there are legitimate health and safety reasons for doing so, you can do that, but you do need to include some very detailed findings in your ordinance.
I see. And we came to those ordinances by getting information from the fire chief or fire marshal. And is that good enough? Or you're saying that each lot that if the planning staff wants to say, no, you can't build on that, it will require some new sets of findings?
No, I think the evidence that you had in the record was good enough. And so we are proposing to move forward that exception. We think it's important to have.
Yeah. And then I just want to understand, when we did the ADU changes, it was very a very clear tenet and important to me and others is that we did not adjust the maximum floor area that people could build. Whatever we changed on the ADU, still people had to squish into the maximum buildable area that they had. Am I right in understanding these, that many, many lots, and just depending how the architect and the owner arranged it, are now going to get an 800 square foot bump up in their maximum floor area?
Yes.
Yeah.
If they've already maxed out on their floor area and they don't have an ADU currently, they automatically are entitled to an 800 square foot addition.
Yeah,
ADU.
wow. Okay, I just have to digest this and what it means for the town.
Now, the one piece that was true, Ann, was that previously they could have done that with a garage conversion.
Right, yeah.
So that was kind of one exception already.
Mm-hmm. But now in this more generous one, right, if somebody already has an ADU, and they are not in the big lot that allows 2 ADUs, then they cannot get this 800. And then I guess since we're the planning commission, I just want to think through, are there ways people could kind of subvert the system or, call what they already have, convert it to an artist studio, and then they can get the 800 bump up for the ADU?
Oh, that's an interesting point. Yeah, the intent of the law is that if you already have a main building and an ADU, you don't get another ADU. You are entitled to a junior ADU, but not a second ADU. That's the intent of the law. It is not expressly stated in the law.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be, another area for director's interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Anne, could I add on to what you're asking?
Mm-hmm, sure.
So I'm wondering, is it worth, when we provided this incentive structure, that in addition to, obeying the district setbacks, that maybe we say you need to basically use the maximum floor area as well, so that we don't let you build 1,200 feet of ADU in the proper setback, but on a lot that already is maxed out? Does that make sense?
Well, AMFA is always going to control.
But my understanding of what you just said was, if I'm fully maxed out and I want to put an ADU 4 feet from the property line, then I can put a 1,000-foot ADU even though I'm fully maxed out.
Right.
Okay, so now I'm willing to put my 1,200-foot or 1,500-foot ADU 20 feet back. Is there anything in this incentive structure that would say, no, we're going to limit you only to the state because you've already maxed out your floor area?
Wait, I'm
I
sorry.
see what
If you have maxed out your floor area, you are entitled to 1 800 square foot ADU.
Even if I thought the state was 1,000 feet within a 4-foot setback. Am I,
In terms of exceeding your floor area
Yeah.
numbers, then that number is 800 square feet. So this is where the different parts of the law are
okay,
confusing. But in terms
Okay.
of the exceedance of floor area and impervious surface,
okay.
that's for an 800 square foot ADU.
Okay, so this whole incentive structure, once you've exceeded, or not exceeded, but once you've maxed out your floor area, then you could get another bump up of 800 feet, as Ann was asking, but that's it. It's 800 feet, regardless of incentive structures, et cetera.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you for the clarification. Thank you, Ann. Do you have other questions?
I do. Yeah, I'm for Portola Valley, I'm definitely concerned about this 4-foot. And I suppose there's nothing we can do about it. Especially if you don't mind me saying, where I live, backing up to an open space, Stanford, the Stanford Wedge, many properties on my road. The property line's kind of a ridge. So this 4 feet, you could just stick an ADU, it would just feel like it's just right out there. It would feel like it's in the open space. One of the tenets of Portola Valley is we have this architectural review committee and really think about placement of buildings. Am I right that this 4-foot is just a flat out rule? We can't do anything about it. There's no opportunity for the ASCC to kind of look at things and say, oh, why are you putting it way out there? Can you move that so it's closer to the other buildings? And then also they often ask for landscaping to kind of soften things that are there. Are we not, the town's not going to be allowed to ask for any of that, even for these 4 feet property setbacks?
You certainly can create an objective standard that pertains to screening or landscape buffer or something like that. But it has to be an objective standard that can be administered through the code as an over-the-counter permit. You can't have a 4-foot setback go to the ASCC for determination on an individualized basis.
Yeah, thanks.
And if I could add a little bit of color, when this law was first passed, I was in communication with the other, what I might call similar communities in Los Altos, Hillsborough, and Atherton about how we were going to deal with the setback. And Los Altos Hills actually proposed something to HCD saying, we have large lots. We don't need to have a 4-foot setback to allow ADUs. There's language that everyone's using. We don't want to physically preclude the construction of ADUs. So could we craft an ordinance that requires our setbacks unless our setbacks would physically preclude the ADU?
Good.
So Los Altos Hills reviewed this with HCD. They originally over the phone said that that may be acceptable, but then ultimately were not willing to approve that. So since they did not approve that for Los Altos Hills, we thought it was not worth pursuing that ourselves.
Okay, thanks. That's a good story. Good. And then as I read some of the information about the junior ADUs, one thing came up to me. What does a homeowner have an incentive to designate and call things a junior ADU? I mean, can they just put in a door and block off part of their other house and just rent it out? What makes them want to have this designation, and why are we spending time defining what counts or doesn't count as a JADU?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's also an area where the statute's a little ambiguous. What's the difference between a roommate situation and a JADU? In the old law, a JADU had to contain an efficiency kitchen. And so that made, in my mind, that there was been a measurable distinction between the two. But now under state law, where the kitchen has been taken out of the equation, I don't see much of a difference between just having a roommate.
And then from a practical point of view, I can tell you that planning staff oftentimes, if we're looking at these floor plans or we see a building permit application that comes across our desk, we may look at that and see, oh, that could be a junior ADU, or maybe that's an ADU. And sometimes we'll talk to the applicant about what they are proposing, because we recognize that having additional JADUs and ADUs could be good for the community in terms of housing stock, affordable housing goals, and meeting our RHNA. And so we oftentimes have those conversations with applicants, and if appropriate, then all they have to do is label their plans that way, and then meet the code requirements. And then there's a junior ADU that's officially on the books.
I see. And I can see then the town has an incentive to label things JADU or not, but the homeowner kind of doesn't care. I mean, it's no work for them if you ask them to, so they do it, but they don't have a purpose themselves to go get it designated. I mean, they can still rent it even if it's not got the official designation, right?
Yeah,
And-
I think that's a fair description.
And can I follow up on that last
Mhm.
question there? Hey, so Laura, you said that you didn't think based on the Los Altos Hills thing, that it wasn't worthwhile for us. I mean, what does that mean? How big, I mean, do we have any way to sort of add our voice to the concern? And is that like a really big deal, like a huge amount of effort? Or is that we write our law, we write it in, and let's see how HCD responds? I mean, I'm sort of struggling with whether or not we should just sort of roll over on that one. You know, and maybe it's not rolling over. Maybe it's very clear to you guys from a legal and, you know, professional perspective that this is a no-win thing. But I sort of feel, just like Ann does, that the setback thing's a really big deal for the town, and we really should question it.
Your point is very well taken. So when this law originally passed, we have a council subcommittee that advises on ADUs, and I talked to them and I said, this is a very big deal for the community. Should we try to take some kind of action like Los Altos Hills is proposing? Our initial conclusion was yes, we should absolutely try, that it would be worth it to write it and to turn it in and see what happened. In the meantime, though, Los Altos Hills finished their ordinance and submitted it to HCD, and HCD said no officially. And then at the same time, there was a housing advocacy organization that indicated to Los Altos Hills staff that they would be challenging their ordinance. And so what that suggested to us was that HCD would not approve it, and we would put ourselves in the position of maybe being challenged by a housing advocacy organization on, you know, the legal basis of our ordinance. So at that time, we decided it was, you know, not worth pursuing because there was a clear answer from HCD.
So Laura, might this be a reason to follow Judith's line of thinking, though, is to write the setback ordinance in such a way that it adjusted kind of automatically if for some reason HCD gets enough pressure to change their mind? You know, this is back to the sort of liberal restrictive question, but, you know, Judith was suggesting that we just set it to whatever the state requirement is. And if we could say HCD release that requirement, then maybe we could automatically release the requirement in our code as well.
I think it's a kind of a question of balancing different priorities. So from an implementation point of view, especially because ADUs are ministerial and have to be approved within 60 days, we want a code and handouts that are very easy for people to understand and follow and design for. So I would prefer that as much be codified as possible to provide that clarity. I haven't heard any rumblings that they're going to change this interpretation. It's a statewide interpretation where many places a 4-foot setback might make more sense than those communities that have larger lots. And I mean, just to be kind of candid about this, communities such as ours that have larger lots don't necessarily get a lot of sympathy in the broader perspective, because there's a stereotype, though it's not true about this community, that more affluent communities with larger lots are imposing these restrictions on purpose because they don't want ADUs. So we're a little bit of the exception to the rule in this case, that we have tried very hard to encourage appropriate ADUs, but people don't necessarily view it that way from outside our community.
Okay, thank you. Ann, you have more questions?
No, that's all of them. Thanks.
Nicholas, do you have any questions?
I do. I just have a few.
Go ahead, please.
And these are primarily fire related as well as timing related. It's 60 days from the submission of a complete application, as I understand it. Is that right?
Yes.
Is part of a complete application could part of a complete application include having fire marshal sign off?
In advance of the application being complete, yes, I think it could. Kara, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. The other pieces are in areas that one of the things that we heard very clearly was concern about setbacks for parking related kinds of issues and on cul-de-sac kinds of in cul-de-sac issues. I'm wondering if you see a potential tie-in between cul-de-sacs, access, parking, and the setback issue that may be important to think about.
I don't think I'm seeing a relationship. I don't know if you can elaborate further on what relationship you're seeing.
If I put a unit directly in as far forward as it can be, that might limit my ability as a fire truck to be able to maneuver as freely as I might want to be able to do.
Because of the parking in the street?
In part because of the parking of the street and also the lack of the availability of the otherwise required setback to be able to maneuver within a tight area.
So are you talking about fire trucks being able to maneuver on the public road or within a larger site on the site?
Well, I think on the public road is an issue with respect to then cars on the street that might not be there, but also then maneuvering on a lot.
Okay, so I can definitely speak to the maneuvering on the lot. Is that nothing about this code amendment would change the fire code regulations. So we still, the fire district will still enforce rules for fire truck turnaround, driveway width, and the other requirements that they would have for any project. So they still have to meet the building code, they still have to meet the fire code.
Do we see that the setback might limit parking opportunities?
I'm not sure that I'm seeing it that way. I mean, perhaps that would be something for the commission to discussion. I mean, if you're asking if I haven't thought through that particular question.
I'd ask that you think about it. I think it's a technical question. I don't have a view.
So Nicholas, can we do a little bit more of that in the discussion?
Yeah.
That's
to say, I personally, I can't advance this at all. We aren't making a decision on anything right now. It's a technical question. My request is if our planning director or other member of planning staff can give some thought to the issue. I guess my last question is, um, other than codifying what's in state law for the purposes of clarity, is there any other value in taking action to implement the state's language at this point in time, given that there are issues in flux? And one answer might be, yes, there is, because it gives the planning director an opportunity to exercise her discretion over an ordinance, as opposed to trying to exercise discretion with respect to a state law. But
Hey, Nicholas, can I
I'm
suggest?
wondering,
Yes, so
if
Nicholas,
I
just
may,
hang on just
if
a
I may
second.
finish my question.
Yeah, my concern is, these are sort of questions about the presentation, and I feel like we're moving into discussion, which is very valid, but we haven't even had public comment yet. So I
Yeah,
feel
no,
like we're starting to get a little ahead of ourselves.
respectfully, I have a question just of staff, and discussion is among the planning commission. So I'm just asking, from a technical perspective, is there any advantage in moving forward? The whole nature of the presentation is adoption of a new section of code. And my question is, why are we doing this?
Yeah, so the law certainly is in flux. I don't know that this area of law has been difficult and complex for a number of years, and it is increasingly becoming more so as time goes by. I don't know that delaying implementing these particular ordinance amendments is going to, solve the complexity of the issue. And then I think another response is that we certainly have some local regulations that we do want to enforce. And it's very confusing to try to figure out which local regulations are preempted by state law and which are not. It's virtually impossible for, planning staff to do that on their own. And it's really not very good customer service at all to have an ordinance that has some local regulations that are effective and other local regulations that are preempted by state law. So I think that there are other ways to address perhaps some of the concerns that you have about the setbacks, but just not implementing the state law changes. I don't think that would advance the town's goals.
Okay, thanks. So basically the reason why we would be doing this is for the benefit that clarity would provide. And we don't think things are sufficiently in flux so that they're going to get better anytime soon, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
Thank you.
You have any other questions, Nicholas?
I do not.
Thank you. So as usual, most of my fellow commissioners have covered most of my questions. I had two final ones. One was on septic. So presumably adding another bedroom or two and non-rooms, but presumably it's going to your septic requirement based on the bedroom. So in terms of this 60 days, will the county already have weighed in and stated their requirements for any kind of septic upgrades, et cetera?
I think that that's a good question, similar to some of the questions that have been asked previously about fire district clearance and outside agency clearance. So I think this is something we need to think about and check into and let you know. I think certainly our intent would be to line up those approvals so that we could ensure we would be able to approve an ADU in 60 days.
Okay, and I'm also thinking, to Kara's point of trying to have clarity to the applicants, that we make it very clear to them that although the state allows their 800 feet or their 1,000 feet in their setbacks, that there are other hurdles that could be fairly significant if the county gets involved. So just making sure that we find the right way to put that package together. And then the other question was on this planning director discretion. Is there any proposed appeal process? And no is an okay answer, and we can have more discussion. But when I read it, it looked pretty open-ended, other than it would be published. But other than that, it didn't seem like there was any way to appeal a decision that the planning director made.
That's correct. And there are processes that do allow appeals, and you could certainly do that. I don't know that it would be warranted in this particular situation. But again, that's a policy call.
Yeah.
We can have a discussion about it.
Nothing there as is, so. Okay, great. Well, that's all I have for now. I'd like to open it up for public questions. So it looks like Rita has her hand up. Can you enable Rita for me?
Yeah, if Dylan, you could stop sharing your screen, and then here comes Rita.
Great. Hi, Rita, welcome.
Hi, thank you for taking my questions. There's a lot of information there, and I just want to ask a few things. So the proposed Stanford Wedge project, does this mean that instead of the 39 proposed units, that if it's approved and done, there's a possibility of 43 on that property? And those smaller places that are the 4-unit places that have a square footage, like the one that has a square footage about 425 square feet and a garage, because of that, it can then have an 800 square foot ADU right next to it? That, perhaps I'm missing something there, but I hope no matter where it comes in the town, I built my home now almost 7 years ago in this town. I came to this town for a particular reason. I love the rural nature of this town. I love it that if my neighbor is going to build something, that I'm going to get a message from Laura and from the planning group and saying, hey, your neighbor's building this. Why don't you come look at the plans? And, what do you think of this? And what do you think of that? And it seems that that's being taken away from us, and something can be, right there on the corner with no trees blocking it, or could be palm trees blocking it at this rate. And, when I built my house, I had to jump through every hoop so people can drive by my house without noticing my house, and had to pay a lot of extra money for that privilege of being here and for people to do that. And it just doesn't make sense that my investment, it's like, I'm getting the big old, shame on you for coming to this town. I could have stayed in downtown Professorville and looked at my neighbor's windows when they raised their home. This is taking away from what the 1,800 homes in this town have invested in, why we came here, the beauty. And so, when my neighbor wants to put 2 ADUs on their property, I don't want to have to look at it. I didn't come here to look at it. And we don't have the infrastructure. Is seismic planning going to happen? Is fire planning going to happen? If we don't have that for the 1,800 people, 1,800 homes that we have now, how are we just going to throw these, things that, because the state says that we have to have it, that they get to go stick it anywhere they want to stick it? Are they going to be painting them yellow? Are they going to be painting them white? Do we have any rights in this process? As neighbors, there was that thing that the town council sent out, the survey, oh, don't tell on your neighbors, do this, talk to your neighbors. I mean, this is going to be not nice for any neighbor. This will ruin our neighborhoods. our relationships with any kind of neighbor. I think something needs to be just addressed here, because, you know, we're being told that what we've invested in is, you know, is like what California Ave and Mountain View. And that's not okay. So I really hope that these things to keep us safe, do seismic safety, let the neighbors choose that they don't want to look at something, some whitewashed small building, then they can't even get out of their driveway. You know, we're going to have all these signs that we don't want saying blind driveway ahead, blind driveway ahead, caution, caution. You know, I just hope these things, and you listen to the people of these 1,800 homes, the 4,600 people that are in Portola Valley, that have invested in Portola Valley. And if that thing didn't work out for Los Altos, send it in anyway. You know, Portola Valley has a long history. We're not afraid of a little, you know, paperwork back. And you don't get anything if you don't ask. But our rural nature, you know, what happened in 1964 in this town is why we're here. And we should just not roll over it and give that up and make us unsafe. And, you know, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rita. Looks like Dennis has his hands up next. Hi, Dennis, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
First, I want to really acknowledge that this is the first time I've listened in to the Planning Commission or other ones, and all you guys doing all this hard work. I, as a 30-year Portola Valley resident, appreciate that you guys give your time and energy, and the staff itself. So it's hard work. And the last person speaking, I understand what she's saying too, and it is frustrating. But the direct question on really was one on the minor issue of having the director, who I have immense respect for, making ruling. I just caution that somebody else in that position, you know, can create you know, a lot of exceptions, and maybe there is some oversight that the rulings that that person does or the guidance that are made maybe need to be done in real time, but maybe they need to be brought back to the commission so we don't undercut, you know, what you guys are doing. And the second is a personal question, because I'm on an HOA along with others that have increased setbacks. And even though, Cara, you're not advising the HOAs, I understand that they may need to take the state's rules and look at them unless it creates some kind of unusual hardship. And if this is an inappropriate question to the Planning Commission because it's dealing with the HOAs, I understand that. But if you have any comments, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Dennis. Carla, could you just comment briefly? I mean, all the stuff we're talking about is still only applies to sort of non-HOA situations?
Correct. So this is another area of law that is not clear. There was a separate bill that was passed as part of this overall legislation that says that any HOA restriction prohibiting ADUs is no longer enforceable. That's as far as the law went. It didn't say that HOAs have to comply with all of the other state law regulations, like the 4-foot setbacks. So I would interpret it, and again, I'm not providing legal advice to the HOA, but I would say that the HOA still has the ability to make more restrictive requirements than the state law, provided they do not prohibit ADUs altogether.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cara. Thanks,
Could I
Dennis.
ask, but you're saying that an HOA could say that the setbacks are 20 feet and then they don't have to go to this 4 feet thing?
Again, it's an open issue, but I think that that's a reasonable interpretation of the state law at this point.
I see.
With
Okay,
the, with the idea, Kara, that HOAs in general were created to provide more restrictions, and
Exactly.
that's their role, and that's what the community agrees to. So it's
Yes,
consistent with their role, unless it's they're just like with us with the state law, that has been taken away from us. It has not been taken away from the HOAs yet.
correct,
Mhm.
correct. And if when the town issues permits for ADUs that are in existing HOAs, we would only enforce we would enforce the town requirements. And if the HOA had a more restrictive requirement, the town wouldn't necessarily enforce that. It would be up to the HOA.
Okay, thanks, Cara. Looks like Betsy's up next. Betsy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chair and Commissioners. I was quite sympathetic to hear an earlier speaker acknowledge your hard work, which I fully agree with. It's just my concern that you haven't seen anything yet, should this go through. The one size fits all nature of a 4-foot setback up and down the state of California is hard to fathom. And I think where I'm going is that the neighbor to neighbor problems that this community is a pretty tight community. And yet I can't help but notice that many neighbors whom I like put their pool equipment very close to their property line. And so there is a tendency to take care of oneself a little better than your neighbor, much as we try to love each other equally. I'm pointing to my concern that we'll all be up in arms and we'll all be on your doorstep. And so I would highly advocate of a diplomatic but a strong pushback at the state level with HCD and the governor. I think that they are going to have, this is not just us. And thank you, Laura, so much for reaching out to our neighboring communities to know that they've tried. But I'd start to get names of those people that they've spoken to and then go to the one above and the one above that. Because I think this is going to be really rip the heart out of a lot of good relationships. And we don't want to squander the tremendous goodwill that most of us enjoy living in this most beautiful place. That's the more important point. If we end up having to swallow hard and consider something like this, because I do want to say I lived in Palo Alto for many happy years, and I had a grandfathered cottage in the back that I was admonished many times never to let anything happen to it because its 10-foot setbacks were abhorrent to the community. And they were very narrow, in fact, and because it was about a 16-foot tall structure, easily could see into neighborhood yards. As this will be the case here, only with 4-foot setbacks, I would urge you to, should we have to deal with this, to look at windows and to try to rope in some way to afford neighbors privacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. So next I've got a phone number, 650-678-7562. Could you identify yourself once you get on?
Hi, my name is Caroline Vertonghen. Thank you
Hi,
for
Caroline,
taking my
welcome.
comments. Thank you so much. I mean, this is a lot to digest, but all the questions you asked make me feel like you're on our side. The problem I have is there's so many issues that we have had that we have not solved. Fire safety, increased traffic, and no real understanding how many people actually live in our Portola Valley, since we have more and more renters, and people rent out their units. We have no idea. I'm really concerned. You brought up in the beginning the drought. Nobody's talking about it. I have addressed my concerns to the HCD directly. We don't get any answers. They have no inventory what has been built, and they don't seem to care about the problems with infrastructure, with safety, with anything. So the questions you asked tonight really made me comfortable, because you really sounded like, well, you are part of our community, and we really appreciate that. Like the others, I do have concerns that suddenly the planning director has discretion. And I don't feel comfortable about that. I hope that you have more power than the planning director. And I hope that perhaps tonight you can make that clear. My real question is, so we have had a unit on our property. It's actually built in our house. So we're willing to help create or help with the numbers of ADUs. So when is the best time to put in an application, even though we don't need it, to make that unit an ADU to help you with the numbers?
So thank you. Laura, do you want to just give her a sense for how she can best contact you? Maybe we could just take this offline.
Yeah, we have all of our COVID procedures are on our website. You just make a virtual appointment. We'd be happy to make a virtual appointment and walk you through the process of submitting that application. That would be great.
That's
We
not
might hold
answering my
off.
question.
We might hold
that's
off a
not my
bit.
question. My question was, when do I apply so it helps you with the next cycle?
Right.
I'm not in a rush. I want to help the town get the numbers for the next cycle.
Yeah, Laura, I think the question she's asking is if we've met our arena numbers for this cycle, when does the next
Which we did.
cycle start?
2023.
Oh, well, that's not helpful.
You say
That's
that is
sad.
or is not helpful?
It's sad because we've reached our numbers.
Well, right, what Laura's saying is we've reached our numbers until we get to 2023, and then we're going to get new numbers, which are the numbers that you've heard us banding around, which are potentially much larger. And those are the ones that we're really going to need help with. So if you can help us with those numbers, then that's probably the best time for you to help.
Okay.
But if I
you.
could move this off for tonight, and if Laura could probably give you more details, or you're welcome to contact me if you would like to discuss this more.
Well, that's the problem with communication. You know, we used to have direct communication. Now we have to actually use our oral communication time to make sure that the different departments have gotten their communication. It's really a struggle, and people are getting very frustrated. We have addressed this issue for many months now. It's almost 2 years with the town council, and there's no improvement. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, looks like Bob, you're up next. Welcome.
Thank you. I certainly second all the comments that have been made, including thanking the Planning Commission and the staff for the hard work on this complicated problem, and others. And in particular, thanking Anne and John for their questions, which reflected my concerns. I picture open space, large lots with multiple ADUs dotted along the perimeter of the lot. I sort of bristle at the idea of people in Sacramento deeming what's appropriate for this very unique community. There's safety issues, there's values that this community has that aren't shared necessarily among other places. So that's a very hard notion to accommodate, that a group elsewhere can make such a profound impact. So my question is about the role of incentives. The incentives that you mentioned, incentivize property owners to comply with the current setbacks seemed disproportionately gentle to me compared to the impact of a 4-foot setback. And so I wonder if there's not an opportunity to be a little bit more aggressive about that. And I don't know what's legal or appropriate, but is there a role for impact fees that would be waived, for example, or something like that? So that's sort of my question. And the one other comment is, people have heard me say this before, and I'll keep pounding this point. The Paradise Fire should be a huge lesson for us. And my feeling is that we're morally obligated to the people that are here and the people that will come after us in future generations. We're morally obligated to prove that we can actually accommodate a mass evacuation. We have to do that, regardless of what is done in Sacramento, regardless of what's imposed on us. Our first priority, it's a moral one, not a legal one, it's a moral one, is to demonstrate with good science and solid data that we can perform a mass evacuation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Looks like Christy's up next. Christy, welcome.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for taking on the ADU planning. I know I would just encourage you to at least look at 10 other cities and look at their guidelines. I have been doing that, a few of those. And what I found was, if your home has a septic, maybe you do a sanitation consult with environmental health services about the capacity of your existing system. We sure don't want to see systems overflowing and causing health issues for those below them. So I don't know what you could write in an ADU law regarding that, but I think it's something to consider. We are also considering doing solar. And so would some of these 4-foot setbacks actually preclude people that have put solar on their properties and then all of a sudden are unable to get the solar that they thought they had? Would be another thing. And it looks like, okay, it's April and we've probably had this law all year. Maybe we don't need to write 4 feet, yet we know it's the law. But do we need to write it in our code? I guess that's my question. And you've been going that direction until now. So that's another thought. And then evaluate constraints or site-specific factors such as steep slopes. And I don't know what you might write for steep slopes, but I think they're quite unique. And we sure don't want landslides. What about double frontages? What are you going to do about that? Agriculture setbacks, existing auxiliary structures. And then I noticed some other cities have fire code setbacks still apply. What are PV fire code setbacks? Do we have that right now? I guess that's my question. I guess you'll answer them all at the end. Then I was reading detached ADU corner lots, and Belmont seems to have an interesting corner lot setbacks. So they have some different guidelines for the interior lot lines. And the exterior lot lines that are on roads. So I encourage you to look at that, and I won't go into those details. But for example, they kind of flip it, but one minimum side setback for a detached ADU is 5 feet from the internal side lot line and the 15 feet from the lot lines on the street. And then it reverses for the other side. So that's something to think about as well. And then are you gonna allow double parking on any driveways? I don't know if that's something. Do we have an ADU pamphlet at this time? I guess.
Yeah, so Corey, Christy, why don't you finish up with your comments so that we can move on to the discussion. So I think this is not the time for a lot of back and forth, but please just, present the issues you'd like us to consider.
Okay. The comment about the tendency to put pool equipment on the corner and right on the edge and think about yourself, that will happen. I do agree with that comment. And I think really working with the neighbors around you, I'd like to see a requirement, that you let your neighbors know what's going on. So I think that's respectful and to write that in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, are there any other public comments before we move to the commissioner's discussion? All right, seeing none, let's move into the discussion phase. So who would like to start off with the discussion?
Well, Craig, how do you want to do this? Because there were 3 questions posed for discussion in the materials, and then there's general, subcategories. How do you want to do this?
It's a good question. I guess we could put the presentation back up and work our way through the questions. I guess why don't we start with it? Are there any general discussions that the commissioners would like to have before we dive into the specifics?
Sure.
We've obviously had a lot of back and forth with staff, so I think that's been good. But why don't we do general discussion, and then maybe Dylan, if Dylan's, I guess Dylan's gone. Oh no, you're there, sorry. Maybe, yeah, after we do that, hi Dylan.
I'm still here, yeah.
Yeah, no, I see you now. I just had to find the right place on the screen. So let's do general discussion, and then why don't we go through the list of questions that's there, and then we can sort of loop back around and then try to close up. Does that seem like a reasonable approach?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's just start with kind of the general sort of high level set of discussions that people might want to have. Anne, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'll go.
Okay, why don't you start?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely in favor of revising our local codes so that they reflect the state law, which, am I right? It's been in effect since beginning of 2020, right? Yeah, I think we've lived with this for 16 months. It was kind of a lost year last year, but if people could have started building the 4-foot things last, a long time ago, or a year and some ago. And I do think it's a service to the residents to have a unified system rather than, read the local laws, read the state laws, you figure out which trumps the other. So I'm glad we're doing this. And then I really like the ideas of these, I hate to call them incentives, and I thought that was a little confusing, that, we're saying if you live with our current rules, you might get some benefit from that, rather than doing exactly what the state allows. So I'm really in favor of that. And if we can be even more creative on those, it'd be good. So yeah, I guess those are my general.
Okay, great, thank you. John, go ahead.
I guess I would echo let's update it. And I've asked the question both sides. Should we do it now or should we just wait? I do think there's, based on the discussion, based on the comments so far, that there's an advantage of doing it now. But I do say that, trusting that, Cara and Laura and the rest of and Dylan and the staff will, if something does tighten up or whatever, move more in our favor, that we'd immediately move to amend our code to reflect that. So I do have a great amount of trust in our staff here on that, and I think we could manage it very, very quickly if things moved in that direction. So I think that's my main. Oh, well, I guess the other one is I'd really, on a general basis, still like to pursue this. Is there any way we can communicate this 4-foot setback thing? And are there any ways around that's, I mean, we heard, if we have to do it, we have to do it. And I know, obviously the public would be opposed to that, but if there's really no option, okay. But, we do things really well here compared to most communities. So if there's some way to push back on that, then I think it's worthwhile exploring that in some fashion.
Great, thank you. Nicholas, you want to comment? And then we'll have Judith.
Yeah, I think that I agree with the comments that have come before. The only other things that I would add are, one, I'd suggest that an application have all of its reviews from a geological standpoint, soil stability standpoint, county septic review, and fire review as part of the application that needs to be submitted, and then run the 60 days from that point in time, allowing planning staff to have a maximum amount of time and not to get jammed at the end. Otherwise, I think you may end up running into some problems. I think the other kinds of things that I heard that were really interesting was, one, reviewing whether there should be a 4-foot setback as part of the fire code. And I would suggest that that be reviewed with the fire marshal to determine whether that is appropriate at this point in time. I think the other item that we heard was a notification of neighbors. And while there's a limit to the effect of comment by the neighbors, just because most of the actions may well be ministerial here. And Carl, you might weigh in if you see things differently. I'm sure you will. I'm not sure I see a limitation on providing as a process step a notice to neighbors of a particular action, even if it is just for informational and advisory purposes. That's what I've got.
I kind of thought we had a notification in there, but.
Well, I was going to ask whether we could make that part of having a complete packet of basically, I've notified my neighbors. Because I think that it goes a long way to start the discussion. And to Nicholas's point, even if it's ministerial, if you have to approach your neighbors and talk to them, then maybe you'll evolve your plans before you get the complete packet coming in for ministerial review.
I'll take that as a friendly amendment.
Thank you. Any other comments, Nicholas?
That's what I've got.
Great, thank you. Judith?
Sure. I have I share many of the comments that have already been made. I think it is on balance in our benefit to update the code because it gives us some opportunities to adjust things for ways of implementing the state requirements in our context. I do have a lot of sympathy for the frustration people have expressed about the 4-foot setback. I find it frustrating because personally, while I'm open to hearing data to the contrary, I do not believe that's part and parcel of increasing the availability of housing in our community. So if we have to do it to comply with state law, we should do it, and we should do it in our way, as has been described. I like a lot of the ideas that Nicholas, Ann, and John have been putting out there as things to consider. I'm not currently convinced that the fire safety piece is integrated into the thought process around a 4-foot ministerial review enough. And I know we have an exception under some circumstances in part of the code. I'm going to need to think about that more just for transparency. It seems to me both to have, impacts on neighbors, which is a very important part of our community, to only have a 4-foot setback. Should there be screening? Should we have different treatments of windows? Is there a way to mitigate, the negative effects and make people talk to each other? But I do also think that there are going to be places where, that proximity can increase fire risk. And I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. So I would probably, suggest that we maybe strongly consider pushback with other communities having done that. The state is going pretty far here. And I don't want to be the poster child of pushback because we as a community support ADUs. We support housing. But I think this particular rule has not been tailored for the purpose and undermines community while failing to achieve its purported goal. So let's consider all of the things that others have already put out there, which are great ideas. The only other part that I will comment on is that we, as a planning commission, we're members of the community. We do serve some purpose in terms of bringing the community perspectives to the table. And in terms of authorizing the interpretation of rules and regs, I'm personally uncomfortable with the breadth of that. If there is a need to be efficient and to allow people to focus and react for the public good, we should put more on the table about how we can make that happen, or tailor this to situations that you've seen be really problematic for you and let us understand those more. But I do think it's a very important part we play, as the community has said this evening, to reflect the values and the sensitivities. And I certainly have every confidence in Laura, but this is a code change. This is not a Laura rule. So I'm very hesitant to just buy into a broad brush approach on that. I'll stop there and let Craig take it.
Great, thank you, Judith.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Judith spoke to many of my concerns quite well. I also heard, both from the public and just, when I listened to this, the 4-foot setback feels to me like it needs more consideration. Not that it doesn't exist, but what do we do about fire? What do we do? Like, it's not completely clear to me, like, if it's ministerial, are there a set of rules that apply to an ADU that's within 4 feet? Like no windows facing the setback or something. I mean, I don't want to get into specifics, but could we make a set of rules so that even though it was ministerial, if you're going to put it in close proximity, then there were a bunch of color choices, window choices, et cetera, that would apply and might be more restrictive than would apply if it were farther back. So we might think about it a way of saying, sure, you can put in the 4 feet, but we're going to further restrict exactly what this building looks like. So I would certainly like to see something along those lines. Nicholas mentioned the fire. And then I thought this idea of potentially of more generous incentives is worth looking at. Because if we really are forced into an uncomfortable compromise with the 4 feet, then maybe the best thing we can do is really try to incentivize people to move them away. Just say, yeah, you could do it, but it's so much better not to do it. And so, I don't know if it's impact fees or reducing building fees. I mean, maybe there's a way that we can do something that's, relatively small, but is enough. It's a little, my thing is always penny poker. You play poker for free, you do crazy stuff, you play for a penny, and all of a sudden it's a different game. And maybe if there's some small reductions in some fees and some other stuff, maybe that's enough to make a difference. So I think it's worth looking at whatever we can do to, I think, minimize the impact on basically the 4 feet.
So Craig, to build on what you're saying, I really think we need to look at, based on the little I know at the moment about impact fees, both the carrot and the stick approach here. So the stick on, if you're going to put something in this 4 foot if it ends up being mandated, that we've got some sticks around that. And impact fees could be a way to deal with something like that, possibly. And then, we did have discussion on the previous ADU in terms on the carrot side, in terms of total sizes, and we weren't quite sure. And we did get some community comments that looked for more flexibility on, potentially larger things. So those are areas that I think we could explore that had been previously expressed as interest from the community that maybe could turn into a carrot for abiding by the setback rules, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think that's certainly in keeping with what I had in mind. I'm okay with carrots and sticks. I think the other thing I'd like to see is how many people, and Laura, this is maybe a question for you, is given that we've been at this for 16 months, how many people have applied under the, I guess, more restrictive, to use Kara's term, hopefully I'm using it in the right direction, the more restrictive state requirements? I mean, have we gotten a bunch of people who want to put things ADUs 4 feet from the property line?
We can look into the detailed data. I would say 4 foot from the property line. I don't think there are any. There have been a couple, though, that are proposed less than the normally required setback, but not all the way down to 4.
Okay.
So I can think of one that was 10, for example, off the top of my head. We can pull that data for you.
And I am aware that the question from Dennis Brock that came in, he actually had somebody within the HOA saying, I can just go with the state law. So, I hear what you're saying, but it doesn't apply. So some people are aware enough to go hunting. And it wouldn't take long, of course, for that to get out in public, and probably just by us mentioning here, it gets out in public.
Yeah, I guess I'm not worried about that. I guess I'm trying to figure out how real the problem is. Because I mean, I totally understand and I appreciate all the public comment that if you have a neighbor who builds something right next to your property, it's pretty painful. On the other hand, given that people tend to move out here to be more rural, are we going to get a lot of that? And so, I think we need to try to understand it better, because yeah, if it's the pool pump equipment problem where, yeah, push it as far away from my house as you can, and that's right against my neighbor, then I think we need to regulate it. And if it's like people don't really want to do this anyway. So I just want to make sure as we approach this that we think about how to kind of move forward in a measured way.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So then the other thing I had on the geohazard, it seemed like, and maybe we can talk about this in the detailed questions, but the geohazard whole thing seemed pretty vague to me. So are we proposing, like, if you're in deep landslide, that we would restrict the square footage the way we do for additions? Or, I mean, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to say there's a geohazard and it's going to ADUs? Because I understand how that was going to play in. So I don't know, Laura, do you have any just sort of brief comments on that?
Yes, briefly, our intent was to apply the same standard, right, that we use. And so like when you review a map modification, or if there's a deviation, there's that resolution that guides those procedures. Our intent is to apply those same procedures to ADUs. And so it's just not something that had come up, but as we were having this discussion about implementing health and safety regulations, we realized that we thought it was worthwhile to expressly describe that.
Okay, but like my understanding, and you can help me get the details right here, but if you're in like potential deep landslide, I think we're very restrictive on what you can do. Like you pretty much can't add to your house in any significant way. I think you get some small increase and that's the end of it. Are we saying the ADUs are just kind of open season? Like we don't get, you know, like even though a house couldn't be added to, you can put 1,000 feet of ADU on a potential deep landslide? Or are we going to say that geologically these things aren't stable and we're going to restrict or potentially prohibit ADUs on certain geologic definitions?
I think the question hasn't specifically come up so far. Our existing resolution is very strict. I agree with that. It's very limiting towards addition of living area. And our intention was to apply that same strict standard because the town has a long-standing practice of trying to create that kind of geologic and seismic safety. So we think it's warranted and appropriate, and it would potentially result in a reduction of ADUs. I think a reasonable case could be made that that resolution is enforceable on ADUs. Wanted to make it expressly clear.
Okay, so
just Greg, to add on to.
Hang on just a sec. Let me just finish, John. Then I'll let you in. So when this comes back to us, we're going to get more detail on the geologic hazard side than we have tonight.
If you're, yes, we'd be happy to provide more information. We would just want to get guidance from you as always about what you're looking for so we can, so that we can give it to you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, John.
So on that specific point, I had actually assumed that in truth, the geologic concerns already applied to ADUs within all of our standard law and code. And it just, we didn't have to call that out explicitly, but in this case, we've decided, yes, we're going to particularly reference it and call it out just to be super clear. But in truth, I was assuming that our standard code applied. Was I correct in that?
You're correct. We were making the same assumption. We thought it was warranted to expressly call it out here because the way the state law has changed expresses an intent that every property should be able to, every residentially zoned property should be able to have an ADU. And so since we have that new intent, we want to make sure our health and safety regulations are very clear.
Perfect. Yeah, exact. Excellent.
Yeah, and I think what I'm to answer your question of what I would look for when this comes back to us is if our goal in doing this is to make it clear to applicants what's expected of them, then I think we need to make it very clear if you're in potential deep landslide, then potentially you can't build an ADU at all, rather than, oh, the state rules apply and I can start on my merry way. So I would hope that whatever, you know, if we look through all the geologic designations, that for each one of them that seems applicable, we say, this is how it's going to restrict your ability to do an ADU as far, and possibly as far as not allowing one at all.
Let us think about that and work on it. The way that that implementing resolution is, there is some discretion that's written into that. So we were trying to address that through an appropriate process. So just let us think about what that might include.
That'd be fine. I'd like to see more detail before I'd be ready to move forward on that piece of it. Okay, great. So I think that's sort of general, and hopefully we actually covered a bunch of the questions as well. But Dylan, if you could now, and I see you're there still, if you could share the screen and bring up the question section at the end of Kara's presentation, we can sort of zoom through these things.
Sure. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Do you want me to blow it up to presenter view, or is this sufficient for everyone? You can blow it up.
You might as well put it presenter view, why not? I mean, it doesn't do us any good to see the other slides, I don't think so.
Okay, let me just swap.
There we
Yeah,
go.
perfect. Great.
Okay. So it looks
Okay.
like there are 3 slides of questions. So I'll start with the first slide.
Yeah, so I think what I'd like to do is I'm going to just mention the title quickly and just if you want to say something in this area, raise your hand and we'll go. Otherwise, we'll just kind of go down through them. So we've got the bedrooms. Anybody want to comment?
I would not do that.
So let me get Ann and then.
Oh, I like the staff's proposal to take the bedrooms out of the question and just have it be the size. It felt simpler to me.
Okay, Judith.
Agree.
Okay. And I think my only comment there is I'm assuming that the county might have something to say about, my understanding is when you go from 3 bedrooms to 4 bedrooms, that the septic requirements potentially change fairly significantly. And I'm assuming that even though we're not going to say anything about bedrooms, that the county might have something to say about it. Is that the right way to think about it? So, okay, great. Okay, anybody else in bedrooms? All right, going to setback incentives. I'm sorry, Kara, go ahead.
So I'm wondering, in terms, I also heard some comments about some additional incentives for the setbacks, which kind of go to the next point, but do you want us to perhaps separate out the 850 and 1,000 to provide further incentives for the setback issue?
Right. So you're saying if you want to go to 2 bedrooms, you got to do the setbacks.
Right.
And can we make that restriction? Can we restrict the ADU that's at the 4-foot setback to being a 1-bedroom?
I don't think we could restrict it to being the 1-bedroom, but if it was the 1-bedroom, we could restrict it to 850 square feet instead of restricting it to 1,000 square feet.
Okay.
I'm good with that.
Mhm.
It's my stick.
Smack.
We need some sticks and carrots.
There we go. All right, great. All right, going on to setback incentives. Should there be additional square footage allowed? Anybody want to comment on that? In addition to what we've already said? Ann, go ahead.
Yeah, we've talked about, we're in favor of it. I had just one thing to add. Just trying to think through as people interpret this. I'd like it to say that you get these incentives only if the whole ADU is back at the 20-foot or underlying setbacks. I could imagine somebody doing it now would build part of the ADU right at the 4 feet because there was some advantage. So they would keep the 16-foot height that they're required. But if it went back further than 20 feet, then they would say, okay, and then at 20 feet, I'm allowed to go up to 18 feet now. But I don't want that. You only get the 18 feet if the whole thing is.
Oh, you are a devious person.
I know, and it's from being on this planning commission. I see the rules we've written.
Wow.
And I see what some architects come and I think, oh my God.
One particular architect might take advantage of that.
I'm putting myself in that mindset now instead of later.
Okay. I was not clear what additional square footage means. I mean, if it's the framework that Kara discussed earlier on, that normal sizes would apply if you are doing the full setback under our base zone, yes. But I wasn't sure if you were asking about us changing the square footage, which I would not support. That's already in our code.
Yeah, so Judith, I think, just to put this in context, these are all questions that were pulled out of the staff report that were immediately after that section. So this is not a new set of questions. They were literally like, that was right after.
I know.
Here's the incentives proposed. And then I think this is just a question of, do you agree with the fact that we have incentives?
Yes.
So I think in answer to Judith's question, that the additional square footage is is what we were referencing in our earlier discussion.
Thanks. That's
So-
fine.
so, you know, as we proceed forward, I might be willing to consider additional carrots, but I think all of this that they're showing on the slide is basically in our current code today. And that's, you know, that's good. Like I said, as we proceed forward, I might consider more, but at the just approving what we already have, I don't see any problem with.
Yeah, well, I think the next bullet here, the next question is, you know, should we go increase the limits beyond? So I think that's both what Judith and you are getting at.
Yeah, I was referring to all
I
four
think we're-
bullet points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I would not go beyond, but I'm comfortable with where the code is now.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I think I heard that from everybody so far.
Okay.
And then should the additional heights be allowed? So any further comments on that?
Same,
all the same.
Okay, and then the final bullet of 1824, same.
Same.
Okay, great. Dylan, could you give me the next slide? Thank you. So does this exception adequately address geologic concerns? I think we've discussed that one, but does anybody else have further comment?
No, I think being more explicit about it. So addressing them is great. Being more explicit from a communication perspective is also great.
And Laura will come back to us with some proposed process for how to think about it.
Yep, and I had highlighted that I needed to think through more the existing fire safety layer. I just label that as something to, you know, that I'll be looking at, but we don't have to go into it now.
Okay, JDUs, efficiency kitchen, comments?
I'm good with all three. I'm good with all three items.
Okay.
Same here.
And Cara, that's something that we can require that a ADU require to have efficiency kitchen? That's within our scope?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is currently.
Okay, great. Because that makes sense to me, because I agree. Otherwise, it seems like you've just created a roommate situation rather than an ADU of any kind. So, okay. Then go into guidelines. Should the director of planning be granted this limited authority? So this seems like this might be a topic right for a little bit more discussion. Anybody else have comments on this?
Oh, I'm basically in favor of it. I feel like when things are new and evolving, it's impossible for our commission or any to be just, you know, cover every single dot. And especially since there might be kind of interpretations from the state agency, I feel like it's a great safety valve to have a person that can make minor interpretations.
So I'm generally in favor of it also. I did think the comments about, do we have a appeal process set out in paper? I mean, I'm sure we in general, you could always have one, but just having it on paper makes sense. And I do think a little more discussion on it is probably good in terms of limits, but in trying to meet the 60-day requirements, I think we're going to have some more capability within the hands of the director of planning. But a little more discussion is probably good too, certainly given some of the various concerns that were raised.
And I would say from my point of view, I'm actually fairly uncomfortable with it. I love Laura, so I have no problem knowing that Laura's doing this, but Laura may or may not be our director of planning forever. And I don't really understand what this means. So I'm definitely open for more discussion, but without understanding what limited authority means, I don't think I can go here. I mean, I appreciate there may be a need, but this feels like a pretty blunt instrument without really understanding which problems we're solving. So either refining the instrument or narrowing the scope would probably work for me. I also think that as a town, we move pretty quickly, and maybe we can find some way to say that the planning director could bring something to the planning commission at the next meeting and could approve some kind of review, just to give like a place to weigh in. I think it's important we on the plan provide is it's a place for the public to say, oh, wait a minute, you got to be kidding, what is this stuff? So I guess I'd like to see some ability for the public to be a little bit more involved than just having planning director making decisions.
Hey, this is Nicholas, and I'm not sure, you know, and I apologize. I'm not sure what this limited authority refers to. What is this limited authority?
Right, so Cara, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. There are several situations where this would apply. When we started approaching this initiative, we found that there were many different hypothetical sort of case by case issues that were that we started drafting around. And with an ordinance like this, it gets very complicated very quickly. And we thought that since we were only trying to address one or two limited situations, that regulations would be a more appropriate avenue to address those individualized situations. So that's one area where this comes up. The second area where it comes up is there's an ambiguity regarding, say, an inconsistency between state law and the local regulation. And it's not one where we could easily conclude that state law just preempts. And so that would be an area where, a local interpretation would be warranted. And then the third category where this would probably be invoked is if our ordinance was just silent on a particular issue that was not a major issue and we needed some guidance. Generally, and I certainly take, I think your comments are good about, putting some guardrails around this interpretation authority. But in general, when a director has this type of interpretive authority, they can never provide an interpretation that is inconsistent with the regulation itself, with the local ordinance. So that's just an inherent guardrail, but it would certainly, we should certainly state that in the provision, just to codify that general principle.
Cara, wouldn't the planning director have that authority whether, or under the three circumstances, have that authority whether or not this provision were included?
That's an excellent point. Most zoning ordinances do have some type of interpretive process, whether it's, the planning director or some ordinances give the planning commission that authority. It is a common provision. Our particular zoning ordinance does not have kind of a catch-all provision allowing the planning director to issue these types of guidelines. So as we have adopted new zoning ordinances, we have assessed whether that authority is needed, and if so, we've included it in the new provisions that the council has adopted.
Cara, I guess what I'm saying, as a matter of state law, doesn't the planning commissioner have doesn't the planning director have the inherent authority to resolve ambiguities within her ordinances that are entrusted for her execution?
Well, I guess so. That's it. Yeah, in some situations, I mean, that's what the planning director does. That's
Right. I mean, that's kind of
their-
my point. I mean,
Yes,
that is
yes.
sort of, it's in the nature of the planning director to resolve ambiguity. If there are silences, then the planning director has to apply a reasoned interpretation that's supported by substantial evidence in any given case. And
Yes.
it feels provocative, and I think that maybe is a little bit what you're hearing, to say, to grant this limited authority. It feels like we're actually granting her something that she wouldn't otherwise have. And I think at this particular time, it may be that is rubbing people a little bit in the wrong direction. But I think as a matter of law, she has that authority, whether or not we include this language. And including the language here, from my perspective, doesn't add a whole lot, because, you know, she's a planning director, and kind of that's what the job is.
So Nicholas, what I would say feels different to me here is if it's interpreting regulations that the town passes and there's some ambiguity, that seems well within the planning director's purview. But we're
Right.
talking about something where the state comes up with a new law that says there's no setbacks required at all. And we need to decide exactly how to interpret that stuff. And I guess I would like to see that not be, you know, done just within the planning department, but that any decisions that are dealing with the contradiction between the state and the town's regulations get a little bit larger public hearing.
I mean,
I can see both sides of that, but I do see the need to act. I mean, I do think some of the reaction that we're seeing is in general, not just on this issue, but, you know, as Portola Valley gets a little larger and the laws get a little more complex, the old ways of you kind of knew everybody and you talked to them and things like that, we're probably having to get a little bit more formal and a little more codified and be a little more strict about the rules and give a little bit more authority, as opposed to just waiting to let all of it happen. So I'm sort of thinking of that when I say I'm okay with it. Putting some parameters around it and being descriptive and what are we really talking about, I'm okay with that too. But I do think, you know, people have to figure out that, yeah, we're not the same town we were when we were founded, and the laws aren't the same, and we cannot operate in exactly the same way. So my thoughts.
But I would say,
so if I can just sum where I am, and that is, I would not be in favor of this because I don't know what it means. And I am in favor of the planning commissioner exercising her full authority, but I'm not in favor of granting more authority to the planning commissioner, to the planning director, unless I know what specifically I'm granting. And I'm not sure I've got the authority. I guess it ultimately is the council that would grant it, and the council can grant much broader. But I don't like this provision because it seems to be granting something either that the planning director already has, or is granting something that I don't know what it is. And I don't like either of those two things. So if we want to take away some of Laura's authority, we can talk about that. No offense, Laura. but, you know, we ought to have that conversation, but this is neither here nor there. I mean, respectfully to the point that's been offered up to us. She gets to exercise all the authority she has under law. Cool. You want to give her more? Cool. What is it? You want to take something away? Maybe. What is it? But this is, I don't know what this means. I'm very happy with the status quo.
And John, to comment on your point, I mean, I agree, as a town, we're getting bigger and the rules are getting more formal, but I do think a core principle of this town is public input.
Totally.
And
Agreed.
that's whenever I see things like this, I always bristle a little bit because I don't see where the public has an opportunity to provide input.
Agreed.
So
It's no,
that was really my main comment.
yeah, totally agreed. It's no different than us bristling on the state telling us what to do.
Right.
That's, yeah.
But the
Agreed.
important point is we're having this meeting and the public is giving us their input about how much they dislike what the state's doing.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean some of this stuff we're not going to have to do anyway, but there is still, the public process is still working.
Yep. And
So,
I hope
okay.
folks are exercising their opinions with their state representatives.
Absolutely. So, okay, if we're good with this slide, let's move to the next one.
Let me just,
I'm sorry, Judith. Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead, please.
I already spoke to the large part and agreed. I appreciate the goal of streamlining and getting a good process down for the public. This is too broad and too vague for me. And I don't understand under law what the default is anyway, and probably could benefit from that. But I will point out that when it came to ministerial review processes for the ASCC, there were grades of types of review, and they kind of, where I left off, and I don't know if it's still the case, they had a point person on the commission that would work with the town on certain types of things. I don't think it's black or white here. I think, okay, if this isn't the right solution, what do we need to do to enable the director to do a certain more defined amount of things? What else is left over to streamline? I think all that's understandable and supportable. This isn't there for me yet.
And so, Carl, one thing you might be able to do for us is, you said as you were trying to draft the regs, you came up with a bunch of kind of weird corner cases. It would be great if you could just give us a dump of those corner cases, because I totally hear you. I understand how hard it is to craft a regulation that captures every little nook and cranny. But if we could see what those were, maybe we can help think about a process that we'd be comfortable in sort of getting through, you know, being able to handle those little things without it being fully formalized in a reg.
Sure. It's a great idea.
Thank you. Okay, any other comments on this slide before we move on? Great. Dylan, could you? Thank you.
I'm
Any
okay with
comments
this.
on this?
I'm okay.
Oh, I actually had questions about this one. Laura, could you, why are cases that people build ADUs and put, I guess, no internal stairs, they put the stairs outside? That seemed odd.
Because they
So,
want to have a
just to-
cheese factory under their ADU.
Or a second ADU.
So people want to, you'll remember we had very detailed conversation the planning commission did about basement floor area and how that should count.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had clear policy direction and wrote the code according to that. What we didn't consider was that people would want to capture that basement area as floor area, not for the ADU, but for the site overall. And by building it underneath the ADU, they're getting free floor area. So they're not having a staircase inside the unit that goes through the 2 floors. They're having an outside staircase that goes to the outside, and then they're getting the free floor area. So we had a
I
case
see.
where they had the ADU and then a garage, which the garage for the ADU, that floor area did not count. And then they proposed a basement underneath all of that. And then that square footage didn't count. We had to make an interpretation on that and figure out how to apply it.
I
So
see.
since the state law now basically gives everyone an 800 square foot floor area bonus, we wanted to be slightly more restrictive on this issue of the basements and also of the covered parking for ADUs, so that we wouldn't have sites being overbuilt with the floor area.
I see. So could we, I have 2 ideas. Could we say that if you build a basement under an ADU, it has to have an internal stair unit? I mean, because our intent was, oh, like a basement helps make the ADU more livable because you'd have some storage or some more area. So force
Yes,
it to have.
you could definitely decide that. That would be a policy point
Mhm.
if that was your recommendation, certainly.
Okay. And is this another place we could have incentives that if you build to the base setbacks, then you may build a basement, but if you go to 4 feet, then sorry?
Yes, that's a great idea.
So that might be another good thing to other people's point. It might help tip the balance that like, well, dang, I'll just build to the 20 feet. if,
Yeah, so I think the, when our original discussion came up, we were, residents had lots of ideas on what they could do with these units. And we were trying to give them the most flexibility on that. And clearly most people in Portola Valley weren't actually interested in the smallest ADUs. They were actually interested in doing something larger than that, for adult children, things like that, or the parents moving into something. So we were trying to give them the most flexibility. Clearly, we're not interested in just trying to multiply ADUs on that. So I think restricting it to internal stairways makes a ton of sense.
And the only comment I would have is, I don't think we need to restrict the stairways. I think we're just saying if you don't put a stairway, it counts against your maximum floor area.
Ah,
Fair
okay.
enough.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody, it's just convenient to build a basement, go ahead and build it, but we're not going to give you any exception for it.
Yeah,
All right, any other comments on the basement question?
I like the idea of having the basement be an incentive. That is a very good idea.
Good. Okay, Dylan, do we have another slide after this, or is that it? Yeah, questions. Yeah, we have questions. Thank you very much. If you could stop sharing the screen, that would be great.
Thanks, Dylan.
Yep, thank you. Okay, so are there any final comments before we wrap up this agenda item?
Oh, I guess there was no discussion or questions on the owner occupancy.
Oh.
I just find this so weird as a rule from the state that if something's been approved during this certain time window, then it can have no owner occupancy. So that persists through perpetuity, right? If a town council or planning commission in 20 years from now wants to change owner occupancy rules, fine, they can do it. Oh, except for these things that were approved in this 5-year period. And then you got to go back and like make sure the records are right.
Yep. Yep. That's it.
Okay, but I guess there's no questions. We're just kind of stuck with this one.
But is that really the issue? I mean, if I build an ADU while I'm the owner and then I move out later after it's been approved, the town doesn't have any say over that. So I don't think there's any sort of historical thing you have to go back. It's just whether you, for the next 5 years or 4 years, you can get your plans approved whether you live there or not. But other than that, it's the same set of buildings. The ADU is on the property. Once it's on the property, we don't restrict whether somebody lives there when they're renting out the ADU. This is just a building permit question, I think. Am I missing that, Laura?
No, we do have an ordinance that says that you have to, the owner has to live in either the ADU or the main building.
And if they don't, what do we do about it?
Oh, well, that's a separate question. Do we really go enforce it?
But it would be against our code.
Okay.
Yeah.
The law-abiding people
Yeah,
are
so we
doing it.
did talk about this. We talked about it many different ways, but where the planning commission landed was to maintain the owner occupancy requirement when we did the last round of revisions. So the owner should live in either the ADU or the main unit. And so the state law precludes us from doing that for that, but we wanted to keep it on JADU since that was your direction last time.
I would do that.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, any other comments on this agenda item?
I'll just say that the point somebody else raised earlier about the ambiguity about the multifamily housing, if we can try and make that right, or to the extent we have the right to have some rules around that are clear and don't result in this multiplicity continuing, that would be great, but I don't have the recipe for how to do that.
Right. We're trying to avoid the cascade effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the state's taking us in exactly the opposite direction.
Well, that could be true, but if we can work on it, we'll try.
But Judith, I think what you're saying is if you add an ADU, that doesn't make your property multifamily, so you get to add 2 more ADUs. I think that's the main thing you wanted clarity on.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
That's the
I don't think the
cascade.
state, I don't think that was the intent of the state. But
Right.
who knows?
Who knows?
Okay, any other comments? Okay, great. So with that, I'm going to close down the agenda item 1 on the ADUs and move on to commission reports. Do we have any commission reports?
There, Craig, I don't know if you've seen, but there is a hand up. I don't know if it's old.
Um,
And
No.
oh, it's done.
No, it's back.
Nope. Your call.
yeah, I mean, we sort of closed public comments, so I will open it up briefly, but I may ask Christy to postpone this comment. So Laura, would you open up Christy for me? So
Thank you.
Christy, I mean, welcome, but what I would say is at this point, we're not really taking public comment. So I want you to be very brief on any comments that you have.
I have a very brief one. Thank you. I think there's power in cities and towns coming together. So if you're considering, that Los Altos Hills was turned away by HCD, what if, 3 cities that are very fire prone on this side of 280 walk into HCD and say, we really feel that 4 foot's not good and we want to do 10, and you bind together with the other cities. That would be my only thought that I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, you guys are going to have to apologize. I think my fan is freaking out, so it may be a little noisy here. All right, so do we have any commission reports?
None.
Any staff reports?
Just one important announcement. The next council meeting on April 28th, the council is going to be talking about the housing element process. So that's going to be a really important meeting if you're available for that or available to watch the Zoom meeting afterwards. I'm also planning on giving the Planning Commission an update after that meeting. So if you're not able to join, I'll give you a brief update and the highlights after that meeting happens.
Okay. Laura, would you do me a favor? Could you send out notice to all the commissioners for the meeting maybe a couple of days before?
Sure.
Just, that way, it'll be a reminder. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to approval of the minutes. Do I have any comments for the minutes of April 7th?
No comments.
One minor one, page 29, red page. Second paragraph. just simplify it by saying Commissioner Haskell asked that the owners further explain their reasoning. It just reads really strangely. That's it.
Okay. Can I have a motion to approve?
I make that motion.
Second.
Second? We have a
Through the
second?
chair, you should open for public
Oh,
comment on the
Right,
minute.
yep.
Okay. Are there any public comments on the minutes from April 7th? All right, seeing none. We have a motion, a second. Is there any discussion other than what the amendment that Judith has requested? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And I'm going to abstain because I wasn't there. All right, so with that, can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
But isn't that your job?
No, we have
Oh,
a
you
motion.
can't.
It's a
Oh,
it's a non-negotiable.
Okay, I move that we adjourn the meeting.
I
A
second.
second? All in favor?
Aye.
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 All right. Well, thank you all very much. I think this is a very productive meeting. Staff, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was excellent. And we'll all look forward to further discussing this topic. Good
Thank
night
you,
to everybody.
Thank
Cheers.
you, everyone.
Yes.
Thanks for doing all the hard work so we don't have to, guys. You're crunching through it.
You bet. Good night.
Bye.
All right.
Night.